Hi everyone, this is Sam, and today we are finishing the origins of totalitarianism. So I am going to walk us through radical evil and ideology and terror, which I think is really probably maybe just because of right now or for right now, the most important part of the book. It's the most systematic part of the book. And it was added in 1958. It's also the only chapter in the book in its contemporary iteration that was initially drafted in German. She wrote it in German for Karl Jaspers as a Festschrift in the 1950s. So I am going to just pull up the text right away. I really want to jump into radical evil. So there we go. So radical evil to banality of evil. And this is debated in Arendt scholarship, and people have different readings of it. Let me let Joan in. Some people think that Hannah Arendt was reversing her notion of radical evil when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, that it was a negation of the radical. Other people like Richard Bernstein argued that she wasn't negating the notion of radical evil that we get here at the end of Origins, but that she was introducing these as complementary concepts to one another. So very simply, radical evil is the systematic process of dehumanization, and the banality of evil is the unthinking actions that are dehumanizing. So I'll leave it to you to decide, and we can talk about whether or not you think they're complementary or not. I tend to think that they are. I don't think they're in contradiction. But she says it is inherent in our entire philosophical tradition that we cannot conceive of a radical evil. So the problem of evil is a classic theological problem. If there is an all-knowing, all-good, omnipotent God, why does evil exist? And of course, this is Augustine. Augustine is always very near to Arendt in certain ways. Augustine, Kant, we're going to get here. And this is true both for Christian theology, which conceded even to the devil himself a celestial origin, as well as for Kant, the only philosopher who, in the word he coined for it, at least must have suspected the existence of this evil, even though he immediately rationalized it in the concept of a perverted ill will. That could be explained by comprehensible motives. Therefore, we actually have nothing to fall back on in order to understand a phenomena that nevertheless confronts us with its overpowering reality and breaks down all standards we know. There is only one thing that seems to be discernible. We may say that radical evil has emerged in connection with a system in which all men have become equally superfluous. The manipulators of the system believe in their own superfluousness as much as in that of all others. And the totalitarian murderers are all the more dangerous because they do not care if they themselves are alive or dead, if they ever lived or never were born. The danger of the corpse factories and holes of oblivion is that today, with populations and homelessness everywhere on the increase, masses of people are continuously rendered superfluous if we continue to think of our world in utilitarian terms, economic terms. Political, social, and economic events everywhere are in a silent conspiracy with totalitarian instruments devised for making men superfluous. The implied temptation is well understood by the utilitarian common sense of the masses, who in most countries are too desperate to retain much fear of death. And I'm going to stop there. We're going to come back to the conclusion because it's important. But so there's a couple of different things going on in here. And Arendt is going to, in the pages I skipped over, she's going to break down the idea of radical evil as part of a system, as part of a process. Let me go. So there are 3 steps. There are 3 steps to radical evil, which she's been building up to make this argument. So totalitarianism is defined by certain elements. Hannah Arendt argues that it is a new phenomena that comes into existence with Hitlerism, and that Bolshevism is a more advanced form of totalitarianism. So it's one directional. There is no perversion of totalitarianism. It is defined by the 3-step process of radical evil, which I'm going to break down in 1 second. It is defined by the use of concentration camps. And it can only come to power if the totalitarian movement succeeds in organizing the masses. So the process of radical evil is connected to the other elements we've been talking about, specifically in the chapter on imperialism, where she talks about the structure of the nation state. And so on the one hand, we have citizenship, which guarantees the extension of rights. But citizenship will always be an instrument of the nation state. There is no right to have rights. We're seeing that play out in interesting ways right now. But stripping individuals of their citizenship status is a way to create literal superfluous masses of people who have no home, no political belonging. So Arendt calls this process radical evil because what it does is it systematically strips people of their humanity by rendering them superfluous. So she says the first essential step on the road to total domination is to kill the juridical person and man. And that means stripping people of their political rights, taking away their legal status, making them live in an uprooted, making them uprooting them. The next decisive step is the preparation of living corpses. This is Hannah Arendt, is the murder of the moral person and man. So first you create an intense state of vulnerability, of total terror. You strip people of their political rights. And then you turn them back against themselves and murder the moral person inside, which means that totalitarian domination will try to destroy all forms of human togetherness, human solidarity. It's that iron band by making people complicit in their crimes. So people are forced to become complicit. So she says there's the nice passage earlier that I think about, that, moral, actually it's from Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, that moral norms can change overnight. And the final step is the destruction of all spontaneity. And that is really the defining element of totalitarianism, which is the elimination of freedom, which for Arendt is synonymous with spontaneity. So she says, after the murder of the moral person and the annihilation of the juridical person, the destruction of individuality is almost always successful. And she says, she adds to this that the alternative is no longer between good and evil, but between murder and murder. And so the ability to act, the ability to will oneself, which is that question of the problem of evil. Right? That was Augustine's answer. Evil exists in the world not because, God, is somehow responsible for it, but because God gave us will. And we can will our actions in a way that is evil. And what radical evil does is it strips away the ability to will, to make a choice. Okay, so that elimination of spontaneity, that elimination of the ability to act, of making it difficult, impossible, creating a state of terror, turns one back against the self in a radical way. So this sets up ideology and terror, because what ideology and terror does is it tells you how that happens for the individual. And she breaks it down into what she calls a recipe. And the very famous quote about loneliness is going to come in here as well. And this whole section is about thinking and what goes on inside of us. So much of what Arendt's writing about always is about thinking. What is our process of thinking? For her, the negative promise of thinking, the possibility of thinking, the potential of thinking to stop, is that it might be able to stop evil. Right? So she's trying to find that place in the will, that place in thinking, that moment of internal catch when we can actually have that kind of gestalt shift and say, well, what am I doing? Is this what I want to be doing? I could be doing something else. Or the idea of risk comes up as well, what one is willing to risk. So Arendt wrote this for Karl Jaspers for his 75th birthday. She was teaching a course on ideologies and totalitarianism at Berkeley while she was writing it. And so she is going to, I think, architecturally set up the structure of the essay around a set of conceptual distinctions, which she always does, and it's usually three, and it's three here: isolation, loneliness, which is really Verlassenheit, or that sense of abandonment, and Einsamkeit, which for her is solitude, but in German, colloquially, we would use for loneliness, or you could use it for solitude. So Verlassenheit is set apart from Einsamkeit, and she's taking this from Nietzsche. She's taking this from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, from, I think, might be subsection 36, where it's called Heimkehr, when it's from the part where Zarathustra returns to the mountain, and he says, oh loneliness, finally I've returned to my loneliness. And Verlassenheit, abandonment, feeling abandoned by oneself, is what he felt when he was among others. Einsamkeit is the being with oneself that he returns to. So she's taking his conceptual distinction here to try to get at two different things. And she wants to show how the personal experience of loneliness can be mobilized by totalitarianism through ideology. Ideology is an instrument of totalitarianism. And so she breaks down the recipe of ideologies to show how ideology is connected to isolation and loneliness. Literally, and also literally in the sense of thinking. There's this beautiful note in one of her notebooks where she writes down these terms, and she writes Verlassenheit, non-thinking, right? So I like to use thought and thinking. One moves and the other doesn't. And she argues that levels of loneliness, and this was a popular post-war argument. So David Reisman, who she was in conversation with, and the Lonely Crowd also makes this argument. She argues that the levels of loneliness rise concomitantly with the breakdown of political institutions and social traditions over time. So that creates feelings of rootlessness and displacement that make individuals vulnerable to political ideology, which offers simple solutions to complex social, political, and economic problems. And she says, whereas loneliness was once a borderline experience, suffered in response to certain conditions like old age in the modern world, loneliness has become an everyday experience of the masses. Totalitarian domination as a new form of government bases itself on the experience of loneliness, of not belonging to the world at all. So we have ideology, isolation, loneliness, and solitude. For Arendt, ideologies are isms, and ideology is a relatively new term from the French idéologie, which was first used during the French Revolution, and it became popularized with the publication of Marx's German ideology, and then Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia. And Arendt focuses on how it has a fundamentally scientific character. So ideology is literally the logic of a thing, the logi of a thing. And this is a nice echo even back to those last passages I read and the prologue where we started, where she really is trying to say, well, why do we have to make sense of everything? Why do we have to subject everything to a logic? Why does everything have to be made reasonable? Right? What is that impulse to make things reasonable, to make them make sense? So ideologies, in the scientific sense, contain an argument about the movement of history. So Darwinism is an earlier example that she gives in the book. And she says, when one applies an ideology in thinking, the result is not a statement about something that is, but the unfolding of a process which is in constant change. So it's not about what is, which is that being alive, spontaneous, I'm here now sensing the world, but it's placing it in an unfolding process which is going somewhere that's predetermined. I like to think about the myth of Procrustes, which I'm sure I brought up before, the Procrustean frame, the bed. He was the murderer and thief, and he had a bed, and he would take his victims, and if they were too small for the bed, he would stretch them out and rack them so that they would die. And if they were too long for the bed, he would chop off whatever didn't fit. So you can think about it as kind of this cookie cutter frame in the way that an ideology operates, because it tells you what to think, whereas what is thinking. And so she's trying to get at that distinction. And this part I think about all the time now, where she says that what the function of this ideology does, telling you, where this fits in the unfolding of history, is that it injects a secret meaning into every event and experience. So everything takes on this kind of secret meaning. Oh, it makes sense. It's part of this bigger movement. So there's this idea then that people get meaning from ideology because it gives them a way to make meaning from what they're experiencing. And they don't have to make it themselves. It's been pre-made for them. And then they get to become part of the movement, right? So they don't just get meaning, they also get belonging. And once ideological movements then come to power, she says they change reality in accordance with their ideological claims, right? They have to make it fit the ideology. So she says there are three constitutive elements of ideology. The scientific character. So ideologies do not explain what is. They predict the future. They explain what comes. They are concerned with motion and with controlling and predicting the tide of history, the would-be history makers. Second element of ideology for Arendt is that ideologies are divorced from experience. So one of my favorite Arendt quotes, the quote I opened the biography with, comes from a panel discussion in 1972 in Toronto, where Hannah Arendt was they were doing a conference on her work, and she was invited as a guest of honor to attend. And she said, I'll come, but I want to participate. So it's called Hannah Arendt on Hannah Arendt. And she says, all thinking moves from experience, nothing else. Thinking moves from experience. So what ideology does is it divorces thinking from experience. And when you divorce thinking from experience, you foreclose spontaneity and you foreclose the possibility of the new, of the natal. You foreclose the possibility of learning anything. You foreclose the possibility of opening yourself to the myriad of experiences that a person can have in this messy reality of ours. And while it's doing that, it's saying, I have a truer reality for you. Right? There's a truer reality concealed behind the world of perceptible things. Think about Pizzagate, comes to mind, or January 6th, right? There's a true reality. And who doesn't want the truth in that way? Like that feels so human to me, that, we're just waiting, for somebody to lift the veil. Or, if you're like me, you think of Dylan, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, right? That's the other side of this. You don't need that. But it appeals to what Arendt is calling loneliness, what Arendt is calling that feeling of abandonment. And it creates a kind of sixth sense. So, and then she says, finally, ideologies do not actually have the power to transform reality because they don't move from experience or reflect on what is. And what they really achieve is the emancipation of thought from experience by following certain logical procedures. So people are given logical procedures so that they can say, this is what it is. So then she gets into what is a logical procedure. And so ideology, the logic of an idea, the logi of an idea. So ideologies begin with an axiomatic premise, and then everything is deduced from the premise, and it has to proceed with consistency. And so she describes this in that last chapter on totalitarianism as creating an environment of constantly fearing contradicting oneself, of contradicting the movement, of saying, did anybody watch Trump's cabinet meeting yesterday morning? Maybe I shouldn't bring this up, but I think the comedians had fun with it last night, and it was, everyone goes around, thank you for your leadership, thank you for your leadership. Right? There's a kind of, where does it come from? Is it genuine? Is it real? We don't know. For some, probably. But there's this fear. This is an operation of terror that infiltrates your ability to think. That's the terror of it. Is it's changing the very movement of your thought. And what this does, and this is how we get to this is where she takes it into loneliness, is that demand for consistency, which destroys spontaneity, destroys the possibility of free thinking, destroys the possibility of, forget heterodoxy, or chewing and walking, I can't do idioms, chewing and walking gum, that's what I was gonna say, walking and chewing gum, is that it forces individuals in that state of uncertainty to retreat inward. They have to retreat inward in order to affirm the reality that has been created through the ideology, which now guides their thinking process. So it's not about reality anymore. I mean, and I think this is really, when we talk about post-truth or truth in politics, this is part of this is what's really under there, is that it's not about reality. It's not about facts. It's not about truth. You can scream truth and facts all day. It's not going to get you anywhere. Politically, in a world that doesn't care about those things, but only cares about power after power. And what this offers, belonging, meaning, yes. And I think something perhaps even more powerful, I will say, is that it promises to make the world calculable. If you have a logic that can be applied to experience, to make meaning from what's happening, that tells you it's part of a greater movement, then you make the world knowable. It is the promise of the siren's song. This kind of thinking promises that you can get rid of the risk. You can get rid of the uncertainty. But the trade-off is internal terror, is the loss of spontaneity, is the loss of freedom. So ideological thinking turns us away. It turns us away from the world. It turns us away from the world that we share with others, of being in the world and making the world together. And it turns us, and this is the loneliness part, and that turning back against the self, is that it turns us away from ourselves. It tells us that it's not even just that we can't trust our own experience of reality because we need somebody to tell us what it is we're experiencing. It's that you begin to constantly question yourself. You actually then don't know if what you're experiencing is what you think it is, or is it something else? Does it have a secret meaning? Does it belong to this thing? And that is isolating in the way that Arendt describes it. It forces thinking into this kind of stagnation. I'm thinking of congealing, molding. So I know this is all very, very uplifting. I think somebody said at the beginning that reading this felt, terrifying. And I think it is, because I feel like a lot of it resonates. So it also creates in that perpetual state of inner skepticism, the other word that she uses is cynicism. So once you confuse a person's ability to trust their own judgments, their own experiences, they no longer trust each other. And so everybody kind of starts looking at each other uncertain. It's a way of surrendering the inner will to bring it back. It's a way of surrendering the inner freedom to think, to the tyranny of logicality, to this ideological way of thinking. And she says that the compulsion of terror presses masses of isolated men together and supports them in a world which has become a wilderness. It's a nice image of, the iron band of totalitarianism, all of humanity pressed together into one calculable, knowable entity, and then just the wilderness, right? It's a way to just, it's literally world destroying. And she says, submission to the force of logical deduction prepares each individual in his lonely isolation against all others for tyranny. And free movement in thinking is replaced by the ideological thinking and loneliness. So then she draws a distinction between Einsamkeit and Verlassenheit. She draws a distinction between isolation and loneliness. So sometimes, isolation is necessary, especially if you're an artist, you're a writer. Isolation can be really powerful and productive for creativity, and people can be isolated without feeling lonely, and people can feel lonely when they're with others. So for Arendt, this isolation, though, destroys the possibility for action. And this comes out in The Human Condition, so also published in 1958. So she wrote this before The Human Condition. But when she talks about action in The Human Condition, she was writing them at the same time, actually. But when she talks about action in The Human Condition, she says that you need at least two people in a public space. Action is something that is done in concert with others. So if you turn the world into a desert of individuals who are isolated against each other, they have no way to relate to each other, which makes action impossible. Also relates back to the destruction of spontaneity. And loneliness is the human side of this, is the situation where the individual feels deserted by all human companionship, including one's own relationship to the self. And she says that this experience of loneliness is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. And I think this is I like to pause here because, Arendt often gets cast as exiling the emotions or feelings from politics. But I think in many ways she does the opposite. And I think she's trying to show us how incredibly vulnerable we are as humans. There's something very vulnerable about Arendt's understanding of what it means to be human, that we are very vulnerable in a tender way, right? In a gentle way, that we have these experiences like loneliness, which are terrifying and horrible and desperate. And if there's a way not to feel that, people will reach for it. Right? So it makes us vulnerable. Our loneliness makes us vulnerable. And so totalitarian propaganda destroys the public realm, isolates individuals against each other, makes action impossible, destroys the possibility for spontaneity, right? And it destroys, this is what she says is the truly evil thing, is that it destroys one's inner private life as well. And it's lonely because then if we are only experiencing the world through the ideology, we're not actually experiencing the world at all. We're not actually holding the space to relate, which is necessary, the space between to relate to one another. And for Arendt, that isolation is the definition of powerlessness. It's the inability to act, to be with others. It's a state of total abandonment, which I think is why she uses Verlassenheit. And then this is the quote. This is the one we hear often. She says, "Just as terror, even in its pre-total, merely tyrannical form, ruins all relationships between men, so the self-compulsion," and I note that she uses self-compulsion there, right? For her, there's always a question of personal responsibility. The self-compulsion of ideological thinking ruins all relationship with reality. The preparation has succeeded when people have contact with their fellow men, as well as the reality around them. For together with these contacts, men lose the capacity of both experience and thought. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, the standards of thought, no longer exist. Right? And that's bringing us back to the will, which is the inner organ of freedom, the inner organ of action, that which propels us out into the world. That inner state of being thrown back upon oneself, that state of inner isolation, of feeling frozen, of not having that moral compass, you could say, or the ability for the self-consciousness to engage the conscious in a dialogue to determine how to act, not knowing if something's real or not real, that inner ability to judge, right? And her last work, you know, thinking, willing, judging. She's trying to see how we might, you know, where are all the places where we might be able to stop this in thinking. And she's not convinced, for whatever that's worth. There's a beautiful hawk outside my window. She's not convinced. Okay? I don't read her as hopeful, but I think she's trying. Okay. So toward the end then, she, you know, she's not hopeful. So what might we do? She transitions to then the distinction between loneliness and solitude. And, you know, solitude is the pleasurable state of keeping company with oneself, where the two-in-one process of thinking is possible, which for Arendt means the inner self-dialogue, which requires a state of harmony, and being alone with oneself, where the self-consciousness, the I, the thinking ego, can have a conversation with the conscience, with the moral questions. It's also where we tell stories for Arendt to ourselves about our experiences in the world and make meaning. So earlier in Origins, she gave us just a short section on Proust, which I think she's stealing from Benjamin, but that's a different story. And she talks about how we hold up, you know, we go out in the world, we experience things, and then we hold up the experience to the mirror and the mind's eye, like Proust with his Madeline. And we tell ourselves a story about the experience that we have. We are storytelling animals. And I think often that if Arendt really understood something about politics, it's that the story is more important than the facts. The story is more important than the truth. And the story for ideologues, for politicians, often comes at the expense of factual reality. That's where the problem is. So how do we as individuals maintain our capacity to think and judge and give meaning to our own experiences without the influence of those ideologies, without the influence of turning to others to tell us what it is that we're experiencing? So there's a kind of promise, I think we can say, in Arendt's conception of solitude and thinking. It's a negative claim that if it's possible to stop evil, then that has to occur before one acts, which means that they have to think about what they're doing. The end of the prologue, the human condition, what I am trying to do, therefore, is nothing more than to stop and think what we are doing. Or personal responsibility under dictatorship, she says, the difference between those who chose to go along and those who decided to resist is that those who decided to resist chose to think. And so there's an idea in there too that we can choose to think or choose not to think. The term that I came up with a long time ago is a kind of self-reflective critical consciousness, right? That's really, and I think I think we all know what that is. And I think it's incredibly difficult to live there, to do that all the time. But I think the temptation not to think is incredibly potent and precisely part of what the ideology promises to relieve you from having to do. You don't have to think about that. This is the right thing. This is the meaning. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Arendt is, let me pull the text back up and we will look at, so this is where I stopped reading the quote. So this is the end of the first book. So this was the conclusion when it was published in 1951. She says, the Nazis and the Bolsheviks can be sure that their factories of annihilation, which demonstrate the swiftest solution to the problem of overpopulation, of economically superfluous and socially rootless human masses, are as much of an attraction as a warning. Totalitarian solutions may well survive the fall of totalitarian regimes in the form of strong temptations which will come up whenever it seems impossible to alleviate political, social, or economic misery in a manner worthy of man. Okay, so totalitarian solutions, the elements of totalitarianism, will survive the fall of totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian elements can exist in democratic societies. I read her to be saying that. Other people would disagree with that. But I think the important part is the promise to alleviate political, social, or economic misery. The temptation, the promise of not having to think, of having those miseries alleviated. You know, whenever someone comes along and says, I have a solution for that. You know, this is why it happened. These are the people to blame. This is how we fix it. Run very quickly. It's not a hopeful conclusion that we get in 1951. Okay, I am going to, how do I get there in a good way? I'll go do this. And so now this is the end of Ideology and Terror. So this is 1958. She says, but there remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. This beginning is the promise, the only message which the end can ever produce. Beginning, before it becomes a historical event, is the supreme capacity of man. Politically, it is identical with man's freedom. Initium ut esse homo creatus est. That a beginning be made, man was created, said Augustine. This beginning is guaranteed by each new birth. It is indeed every man. A very different end. And, you know, Arendt goes back to this Augustine quote quite often in her work. And she doesn't give a solution. She's not going to predict the future. She's not going to give a program or say this is what should happen. But she says things can be other than they are. People can always choose to act. Beginning before it becomes a historical event is the supreme capacity of man, which is identical with freedom, which is that spontaneity, that totalitarianism kills. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna pull down gallery and we can talk. I can say a bit more about the different endings, but thoughts? How's everyone doing? Oh no. Marilyn. Hi, Marilyn.
So wait, when you're saying Am I muted? No, I'm muted. Okay.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay. So you were referring to thinking a lot, and as a psychologist, there's two kinds of thinking really, and maybe this came after her. There's thinking like I'm thinking that I'm looking at you right now. But then there's reflective thinking, which you mentioned at the end, like I'm thinking about thinking. And the tradition of psychoanalysis, at least the contemporary trend, has been to really elaborate on that idea that we are all thinking all the time. But I think what you're talking about is the capacity to have reflective thinking, insight, introspective, meta-analysis. There's a lot of words. So I wonder, did Arendt ever make that distinction? Because it is a little bit muddled when she just says thinking, because there is a difference. And I think cognitive neuroscience has substantiated this aside from psychoanalysis.
Yeah. I think she does, but not in psychoanalytic terms. And she does in different places throughout her work. And I can share some essays. Obviously, I think the book to go to is Thinking, which she did finish while she was still alive. It was the most finished part of the book. She had gone through 4 drafts and edited it and
Mhm.
had moved on to writing Willing Out, and was working on the judgment lecture. So it's the most polished part of the book that we have. And I would get the critical edition version that was just published. Mary McCarthy actually heavily edited Thinking. So there are a couple of interesting substantive changes that
Okay.
McCarthy makes. But for Arendt, so in Thinking, for example, she does talk about like, so what is that I of reflection? And she talks about the biohistorical narrative self. So she draws a distinction between the ego, the self-consciousness, which is the I, and the self-reflective, the self-reflective, um, and the conscience, the kind of underlying moral beliefs. But in there, she's trying to find the place for the self-reflective consciousness. So where and how do we engage in reflective thinking? It's not thinking in the ordinary sense of, it's like, okay, I have to do my laundry later and make dinner. And it's not that. She's talking about, I always think of, different examples. One would be Machiavelli, the famous seventh letter. He goes home, he puts on his robes, and he sits in his study and he converses with the ancients, having a conversation. Arendt was a very dialogic thinker. She says Socrates is the thinker par excellence. And she describes the Elenchus method that he used, through the analogies he used to describe himself. So the stingray who would freeze, first you have to stop. She says, in order to think, you have to stop. Because if you're acting, you're not thinking. Thinking for her precedes action. And then the gadfly who irritates the thinking. And this is a distinction she draws between thinking and willing. So thinking for her requires that we be in a state of internal harmony where I can have a conversation with myself. Whereas willing is defined by disharmony, where we feel ourselves torn in multiple directions. So she talks about thinking, she draws diagrams of thinking and thinking, and she talks about thought trains, so we can follow a thought down a path, and then we can come back. But for her, thinking, she uses Kafka's parable He, and says that, we are positioned between the forces of the future, which are pressing on us from one direction, and the forces of the past, which are pressing on us from another. And he rises up over the line of being, but never leaves the world in order to look down. And so for her, she goes to Auden, the timeless track that thinking beats. It's timeless for her. It's a way for the self to step out of the line of action. You have to stop in order to think, stop and think what we're doing. So for her, stop, and then the reflection, the questions, the narrative, the storytelling, and then the wind egg, which is the third analogy that Socrates uses, which is you get to the end of a thought or a thought process and you start over. She says thinking only ceases with the breath. There's no end in thinking. But she is very much talking about that kind of self-reflective, critical consciousness, that engaging oneself in a dialogue, and almost as an intentional activity of something that we might do, but for her, it's not action. It's critically important that it's not action, because action is what we do in the world when we're appearing before others. In the space of solitude, there's a kind of freedom that comes from being alone and being able to engage in this type of thinking, which is necessary for meaning, it's necessary for writing, necessary for many creative processes. Does that help? Or there's
Yeah,
a lot
that's really good. And just one short other follow-up. So I think she's implying that the breakdown of the nation state caused severe economic, social, and political difficulties that maybe interfered with people in the 20th century being able to think reflectively because their needs were such they became superfluous. Is that an implication?
um yeah, I would be yes, I would massage maybe the order a little. So the breakdown of the nation state gives rise to superfluous masses of people in two senses in the book. One, in the sense that it destroys traditional class distinction. And so that's the creation of the masses. Totalitarian movements cannot succeed without successfully organizing the masses. Where did the masses come from? The masses came from the breakdown of traditional class society alongside the breakdown of the nation state. The other side of that is the superfluousness of individuals who are stripped of their legal rights, who are stripped of their legal status, who are literally rendered superfluous people, placeless peoples who have no recourse to rights because they don't have citizenship. And so there's a relationship between those two things. But I think in there that with the first one, with the creation of the masses, the successful organization of the masses depends upon having created that feeling of uprootedness, of existential uprootedness, of taking away one's sense of place in society. And by society, I don't mean like, society. I mean like the world that we share together, right? We would maybe talk about it in terms of community. I've been working on this book on loneliness forever. And, one of the biggest predictors of loneliness is, having to move. So oftentimes big life changes come in bundles. So if somebody dies or you get divorced or you lose a job and you have to move, right? It's not that suddenly you've lost, just one thing. You lose friends that you used to have, the kind of the community, the neighborhood, the place. So the uprootedness of society that happens in those critical years during the Industrial Revolution between, let's say, like 1848, around the time, trains were synchronized, the coordination of the clocks, and, right up to the beginning of World War One, about 19, you have massive population shifts during this time period. The the world, the landscape of the world changes. There is literally a placelessness that accompanies modernity at this time. Aristotle has a beautiful definition of space. Sorry, it's just the way my brain works. And he talks about how we determine where we are by describing what we're standing in relation to. So that means that you have to be able to see what's around you. right? That's how you know where you are. What happens in a world that is entirely connected is that there is no space around us anymore, which means there's no place. There's a literal sense of placelessness that arises in modernity because everything is suddenly connected.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Very helpful. Yeah.
It's not very happy. I'm sorry. I feel
Well,
like
it's
you need to
true.
teach a class on happiness or joy or like, something someday. Yeah. No, it's kind, I mean, there's something, it's very romantic in a certain sense, but in the sense that romanticism, has historically been tied to the rise of, Nazism.
Well,
It's
just as a psychologist, I wonder about the vulnerability of human beings to this. That's in a psychological way. That's a question that started me thinking about this.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, what I think that vulnerability is really important. Lindsay Stonebridge, who I was with in Barcelona a couple weeks ago, she in her book, her biography of Arendt, she has this beautiful quote that we were talking about how Arendt in a letter to Jaspers talks about the need to have a thick skin and that some level of alienation is good in the sense that it creates distance for oneself. So to kind of, I think she was scared of how vulnerable we were. And so there was a real question there, both tenderness and how to have a thick skin. How do we both, I mean, she really talks about the space between people, which I love, that, it's not, she argues against equality. What does that mean? She argues against, this idea that we're all the same. What she's saying is we're different and we have to nourish the space between us so that we can have a relationship with one another. And we become vulnerable when we're isolated from one another. We become vulnerable when we begin to abandon our own selves. And so there's a real, for her, I think, existential question of how are we to be in the world with others? What kind of skin do we need in order to survive, in order to exist? How do we think about the vulnerability that loneliness creates? How do we think about the vulnerability that love creates? How do we think about the vulnerability that anger and violence and rage creates when there are no spaces for those things? You know, and how do they then become part of politics? Which is, I think, she picks up in On Revolution, where she talks about, people were moved to join a political movement because they felt such sadness and despair and, and sympathy for the downtrodden. But that, she says, that can't lead to stable political institutions. It's not that those are bad things for her. It's just that when politics seizes upon our affective vulnerabilities, our emotional vulnerabilities, our human vulnerabilities, it's very powerful, but it can't guarantee freedom because it can't create anything lasting or stable. What is more volatile than the human heart or human emotions? And there, you can feel the despair of there has to be a way to guarantee a kind of basic belonging, a basic political belonging. Like you will have citizenship, you will have the right to move, you will have, the right to participate in politics, which means to help shape the laws that govern your everyday reality. Um, anyway, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in?
Um, can you hear me? It's Ninja.
I can hear you.
So where does the concept or the idea of love fit into all this? Like, I know love can be defined in many ways, but where do you think it falls in?
I think I mean, I could give you the cheeky answer and quote the human condition and tell you that love is not only apolitical, but it's the most powerful anti-political force in the world because it turns us inward toward another and away from the world of being with others. But I think love, in the political sense that Arendt ends the book with in 1958, and that quote from Augustine, is her definition of what it means to love the world, which is, her kind of secular reading of Caritas. She wrote her dissertation on the concepts of love in St. Augustine. And in the notion of Caritas, she found a way of there are different, I think different, you can apply different terms to it. Some people want to think of it as a kind of ethical commandment that we have a responsibility to make and share the world in common. And for Arendt, that is love. But, as a personal kind of affective feeling that we experience, there's also the beautiful moment in the 1964 Günter Gauss interview where, he repeats Sholom's line to her, "You have no ahavat Israel, you have no love of your people." And she says, "You're right, I don't love any people. I love my friends." Right? But I think of it as a kind of, she has a definition and an understanding of a kind of private love, which extends to friendship and romance. And that for her turns one away from the world of being with others, inward to that private realm, which is necessary and important just as much as the public is necessary and important. And then she has the kind of secular political version of that, which is this idea that we have to love the world as it is with all the evil and suffering in it. That we have to accept what is, and not try to make things what they're not. Because the moment that happens, we're not loving, we are controlling, and we're trying to control meaning and the tide of history, which is what she's afraid of here. And I think that's why she ends in part with the Augustine quote about natality and the promise of new beginnings, which is very much connected to Amor Mundi for Arendt. I think Arendt really, I mean, I'll take off my hat, and I've always had the sense that I think she loved the world very much. I think she loved life very much. And I think that's why I, in part, have always loved about reading her work, is that that feeling comes through on the page. Like, she really loves the world. She cares for it, and she wants to find a way to preserve it, to keep it, to make it.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a great book someday that someone will write on love and politics, but I think Baldwin's also a really good person to read right now. And Arendt also had an interesting exchange with Auden on love and forgiveness. It's in the archive. I don't think it's been published, but you can, if you go to arendtindex.com and put in Auden, you can find it. I think there's a kind of desire, especially in moments like these, oftentimes to turn away from the world because it's easy to not, it can feel very inundating or overwhelming, perhaps that's the better word. But Arendt never looked away. And I think there's
No,
real radical affirmation in that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is actually a nice note to end Origins on. It's better than the despairing.
well, I don't think there's a place for despair right now. If you despair, then you might as well walk away from it all. It's facing us. It's very close to us.
I mean, I think that's why she frames the prologue by saying this book is written against radical hope and radical despair. We can't give in to either.
Uh-huh. I like
Sorry.
it.
Oh, go ahead, Ninja.
No, I just said I like that. Yes. I love it a lot. I'll think about that.
Oh, I was just gonna say, for those of us who have lived through it, so I grew up in an authoritarian system in Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, and I'm seeing everything through a different kind of lens, and it's scary, and it's very hard to keep hope. It's for me.
I'm with you actually right now. I don't really have a lot of hope. When I was in but that doesn't mean I have despair either. I don't have despair, but I don't have hope. I do believe in people. When I was in Heidelberg for a week doing a series of talks I was with Paul Holdengräber and George Proshnik, who writes beautifully on Shalom and Zweig, and Josh Cohen, who's a brilliant psychoanalyst and writes about literature, who I adore, and brilliant thinkers. And each of us at various moments broke down crying in public. I think because, some people more than others for various reasons, everything that there's so much grief in all of this right now. There's so much grief. I feel so much grief. And it feels like there's no place for it sometimes. And I think Arendt is a good person to read to like put your feet on the ground, or I think the kids say touch grass, but I think she's a good caution against going down the rabbit holes of despair and hope and going down the rabbit holes of, oh my God, the world's going to implode or everything's really fine. I'm just going to wait it out. I think she's always orienting us towards thinking about what we can do. Like, what is it? What is? And is there a possibility for action? Thank you for sharing that, Loredana. Yeah, Mary.
The question that I keep coming back to is, where do we place that hope? In what? Okay, and I hear a lot of people saying, well, the courts are going to save us. Now and then we get a court opinion that's kind of like, well, it's sort of okay. And then if Arendt looks at the Dreyfus affair, which was a court proceeding, a trial, as kind of the harbinger of the end. And
Interesting. I hadn't made that connection.
And I spent a whole career in the courts, and I have no faith in the courts to save anything. But I'm just curious of how she gets to where you find the hope. What is it? It just can't be individuals because it's all too powerful. So where do we find a locus for it? And she's not the writer to go to if you're looking for the courts.
No, I mean, for her, it's natality. It is that Augustine quote. I think that's as much hope as she ever had. She wrote a piece, from the 40s where she said, hope is the great enemy of the Jewish people. Like, if you give in the hope, you put yourself in a very vulnerable position. And I think there are different ways of defining hope. There are different ways of thinking about what hope is. For Arendt, if we can, I don't think she would use the word hope. I think it's the promise of new beginnings. That's it for her. As long as there are people, we make the world. We make the world we live in. Nobody else. We make the world that we live in. And we can always make the world other than it is. That's it for her. And she doesn't say, what that is, that would be, I think, that would a contradiction, but the possibility of a new beginning is what she holds on to. And it's, I think acting or participating in politics can feel very disempowering often, but there can also be great moments of invigoration. And it's something that we do together with others in concert. Action for her is collective. I don't think she would, in the 70s, toward the end of her life, she was not very hopeful about American democracy surviving, because she was already starting to see the breakdown of the separation of powers, which for her were what literally held everything in check. Bad pun. But that, I think it definitely wouldn't be the courts. I mean, she wouldn't be looking for a stopgap there. I think she would be looking for forms of resistance, honestly. What are the forms of protest? What are the forms of resistance? What are the forms of action that we can engage in? And I think there really is a question of language. She constantly turns us back to just even becoming aware of the language we're using. How does the language one's using make the world, shape opinions, feed into those underlying moral beliefs that one holds? What are the narratives? I think she attunes us to the narratives. Can we change the narrative? I think that's a very real question about language, and finding language is very important. I mean, she believed in the power of political action. And she also thought that we needed stable political institutions to guarantee freedom, rights for individuals, but also that those institutions nothing's ever fixed. There is no future, we don't know the future. There's no such thing as absolute predictability. Like, they have to be expandable. They have to shift and change and move. And was it Jefferson or Madison who said we need revolution every 5?
Jefferson.
Jefferson, thank you.
Jefferson.
Yeah. She agreed with Jefferson, but she also understood revolution in the scientific sense of the word, not as a burn it down, but a new beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, I picked up your Critical Lives biography of and in chapter 10 on friendship, you cited a Los Angeles Times review of books from Kathleen Jones. She was a professor and a friend of mine at San Diego State, and we always connect once in a while. So I sent her an email the other day, and my subject line was, "How do we do this?" And she wrote a long response.
What did
and of
she
course,
say?
she sources, essays, a couple more essays by Hannah, and but she says, you know, I'm doing yoga. I'm going to plant a garden. She's on the East Coast now, and it's like that. She says we'll have to Zoom sometime, and there's still that connection because it was over 40 years ago. I had these seminars with her, and she was a friend. I mean, as well, and it's interesting that I have to reach out once in a while with her, because I know she's done a lot of work with Hannah, and I don't know, I'm not really going anywhere with this, but it's just like you're looking for a temporary life preserver to hang on to. And I mean, we participate here. Sometimes I get excited. Neil Young and Joan Baez with Bernie Sanders, like 35,000 people in LA. But I mean, that's kind of sad when, 60s people are, is this dependent on, well, we have to live another 20, 30 years for something to happen. And of course, if you're so involved in reading everything, you get more and more depressed.
Yeah.
Imagery of, Gaza, the deportations, because I taught farm worker kids, and I'm wondering, has any of these been picked up, or, how are they dealing with it?
Yeah.
So I trying to leaven all that with some degree of optimism that people will rise up, with connecting with people I know, um, not looking for answers for them, just solidarity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the right word, and community and friendship, and that's also how action happens. And I like yoga.
Yeah, the last the last protest we were at in Eureka, we had about 1,000 people, and or even our realtor. I mean, he's just an ordinary guy. I mean, it's not like big city real estate, right? And we're standing and we're talking about all this, and we're basically talking about the distraction at certain issues like tariffs. This is all a distraction. And out of my, peripheral vision, I see a couple of people down, and they're just nodding their heads as well. Um, I mean, you get a good feeling with that. We're all out there. Um, and then you go home, and you say, okay, how much more do I need to consume today, to pull that good feeling down? I mean, I'm reading, I think I'm just driven to understand as well. Although I know 10 years ago, I told others and myself, I said, nothing in my past academic work right now I can access to explain this,
Yeah.
what was happening, because we joked about it 40 years ago, friendly fascism, and during the Reagan administration, the things that were going on then. But I think there's always it was a facade we put on, kind of a dark humor, and then you go on and you continue with your life, and you watch certain trends, and you just never quite, I guess, mentally accepted that this would get this far
Yeah.
here. But I always, being relatively the glass is half empty person, I, I didn't dismiss it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't give up. Got kids and grandkids, so.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, that just, yeah, anyway. uh, but it was, yeah.
Sam,
It-
and Michael, I think the scariest part about this, like Hannah says it too, that things can change overnight, like norms will just fall apart.
yeah.
And it will become a new society in which this is going to be the normal, and people will forget how it was to be a different society. This is what I lived through. It's going to be this way, and then, there's nothing else to be done, really.
Well, I mean, I think that's the. I mean, I, I, I think I still feel a kind of a bit of shock watching the mobilization of the Jewish question through this
Yeah.
new anti-Semitism being
Mhm.
instrumentalized once again.
Yes.
This is such an old maneuver.
Yeah.
I didn't think I would live through it. I didn't think I would have to watch it unfold. And of course, it makes actual anti-Semitism worse for everyone. Um, and I think the way some of these things are connecting with each other and unfolding from one another, from the anti-Semitism to the, adding 6,000 immigrants to the death list, to putting Colombia in a receivership, to the gutting of American universities. They don't actually care.
Mhm.
And that's what I'm finding really, really, I guess, terrifying right now, honestly. And I think the real terror is that, like, I have no predictions. Like, I don't know how much worse it's going to get.
Yeah.
Every day it feels like there's more, but the not knowing is terrorizing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And is that incredible quote in Hannah's book about how all these positions are replaced with these like basically the incompetents and the sycophants, right? Like it was really in one of the recent chapters. You know
Yeah.
which one I mean?
Oh, the crackpots and fools.
Yes, exactly right.
Nothing
So
ensures loyalty better.
yeah, it's just incredible. Like it's just perfectly describes but that's the scary part. I mean, I don't know if anyone saw that.
Yeah.
Let's call it a conversation between the Kennedy Center musician and the new Kennedy Center. What's his name? I can't remember now. It's like it reads like out of like a novel. Like it's just incredible, truly, how you have like these two worlds coming like this musician who's asking like really like rational questions, and this person on the other side who's like an ideologue, whatever he is, but just that to me is like the scariest one that I've seen. It's scarier than Trump cabinet meetings because it's like, it just tells us that the people in charge are something out of this our understanding of reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
Has anyone seen that interaction
I don't,
between the Kennedy Center musician?
if you have a link to it, you can put it
Yeah,
in.
she posted it on I think it was on Instagram. Yeah, I'll try to find it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And she just screenshotted all the emails she got back from the new leadership.
Yeah.
I'll try to find that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me
Sounds
see.
like it might be good material for a comedy sketch.
It's
Yeah.
too scary.
I think keeping a sense of humor is really important right now.
Right.
I agree with you. It's a real relief. Yeah, I find I watch, John Oliver, various people. Yeah, it's
Yeah. I really wish George Carlin was still alive right now.
oh, and Richard Pryor.
And Richard Pryor.
God.
Charlie Chaplin, I would take right now.
Yeah.
Great dictator. Oh my God.
Yeah, it feels like a good time to rewatch that. Speaking of crackpots and fools. No, it's good to laugh. It's good to be able to make fun of it. I mean, Arendt says that, she's stealing from Brecht, that the great criminals must be exposed. They must be exposed to laughter.
Yeah.
Laughing at someone like Trump is probably a good way to a good form of critique. I mean, the court jester historically has often been one of the most politically powerful roles. The one who can call the authority of the leader into question.
So who's our fool?
Yeah,
Who's the fool?
who's our court jester?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I saw a 2016 quote from Rubio, talking about strongmen,
Oh,
calling when he was still a presidential candidate, right? And I don't know, can't even call it bending the knee anymore. I mean, I don't know what it with him, Cruz, all the rest of them. Not that I respected them. Yeah, and then the language of they're sticking to that line. They're terrorists, they're criminals, they're even this poor guy they're trying to whoever's trying to get him back, they still insist on characterizing him as that, MS-13. I remember at the high school I taught at, it was rural Fresno County, and the sheriff's department would show up with this big notebook and all these pictures. They said these are all, gang members or gang affiliated or whatever. And we had a few events out there. You get I-5 not too far away, so it was a lot of stuff not a lot of stuff going on, but I mean, even then I was I didn't want to listen to them very long because I knew where it was going.
Yeah.
I mean, even on 9/11, I knew it was going. I had a son in the military, so I knew where all this was going 25 years ago. And then we can probably, if we want to start a date to, this authoritarian, I mean, we can go far back, but the Patriot Act,
Yeah.
I mean, justified getting anybody's records for any reason,
That's
not just to see if this person was a terrorist, plotting something. It was just another step towards the power of the police state.
yeah. No, I mean it's really incredible. Daniel Allen has a really good book on privacy and in that moment. And where she draws a lot from Arendt too. But it's I mean it really is incredible how we just accept it being surveilled all the time.
Well, there was a company in Fresno, Pelco,
Hmm.
and they made oodles. And all of a sudden all the campuses got cameras.
Yeah.
And then I think they were bought by a French firm later. But you'd see license plates, Pelco 2, Pelco,
Yeah.
I I mean the capitalism that runs around that people's basically capitalizing on people's fear. I mean, the school gets, some kids go do some vandalism, and the next thing you know, you get cameras in all the corridors, and nobody
Yeah.
really questions it, and then uh, so here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I think it's if we were to write a new kind of origins of how we got to this moment, 9/11, expansion of federal
Well,
oversight,
even how they're using all this old
privacy,
legislation, the
technology.
1798 Alien and Sedition Act,
I know.
all of them, they all have little loopholes, vague language, right? And they just exploit all that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heritage Foundation.
Oh my gosh. Don't go down. I've been spending too much time reading Heritage Foundation documents. I don't regret we could do Project 2025 together. That's
Yeah,
terrible.
well, yeah, I was
Dude,
following some of that stuff before the election. Yeah.
uh, I want to mark the time. I know if you have to jump off. This has been, I really enjoyed this. It's felt nice to come here every Sunday and to talk about this book and to have this time together. So thank you. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
present and being here. And it's nice
Thank
to meet
you.
some of you for the first time. And we can do just a kind of anyone kind of open conversation next week. And if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, I no lecturing. Um, and yeah, no, thank you. I really mean it. And this really kind of kept me sane in some ways the past couple of months. So I'm looking forward to Herman Brock, a little poetic interlude that will be read alongside, not straight through what's going on. Maybe that's a good way to put it. So, anyone want the last word?
Take care of yourselves.
Yes, everyone, take care.
Okay.
Just to say thank you so much, Sam. It was amazing.
Thank
Yes,
you.
yes, wonderful to meet you all too.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yes,
everyone.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, makes me